Hey, welcome back, Doug Pagitt Radio, 121. And we're in a conversation here with Eugene Peterson. Eugene is the author of a book called The Pastor, and it's a memoir. And for many of us, this has become important because Eugene Peterson's thoughts and life and pastoring has been important to us. He is the author of a translation of the Bible called The Message, as well as a number of other books that if you're a professional religious person, you have perhaps come across his ideas in his long and very rich life. And Eugene has written this book that tells the story of being a pastor and what it means to be a pastor. And Eugene, there's a particular quote inside the book in the introduction that I think is interesting, and I didn't notice that it was on the cover of the book until after I noticed it in the introduction, that you're talking about the process of becoming a pastor and what it meant for you as a young adult who was attending school, and that your faith was important to you, but who you were going to be in a public way was a little more vague. And you ran across a poem where the poet uses the phrase, "every step an arrival." And you note that she was giving account of her development as a poet, but you recognize that was really a metaphor for your own formation as a pastor, that you were becoming a pastor and you didn't know it, but it was happening with every step.
That's correct.
Talk a little bit about that process and maybe how that and why you start the book with that introduction and why that's important for you. It seemed to me that part of what you were trying to say was being a pastor is something that should come from you and come in you, and not just be a role that you're trying to play or a job that you're trying to fulfill or a duty that you're trying to accomplish.
That's true. I think the place where this started to happen was when I was going to be a professor, and I was teaching at a seminary, and they weren't paying me very much, and so I needed some extra money. Hebrew and Greek professors aren't high on the list of popular professors.
Right. You were probably thinking you had to say to people, "Would you like water with that?" Right?
So I took a job as an associate pastor with a man who, I hesitate to say this, but because as you grow up, you have a very adolescent, distorted view of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And but this was probably the first pastor I'd ever been around close up who I just felt was a man of God. And I just didn't know that happened. And the fortunate thing about it was he was very different from me, and there was no way that I could copy him.
Oh.
So I just knew that it was possible to be a man of God and be a pastor. But that didn't happen. I mean, that didn't come about until 2 or 3 years later, when I was teaching a course in the seminary, and it was on the Book of Revelation. And suddenly I realized, I'm not really happy in the classroom. I love teaching, but there's something so, especially with Greek and Hebrew, there's no ambiguity. It's just either right or wrong. And I was feeling suffocated. I taught my courses at the seminary in New York City for 2 days a week, and then the rest of the time I was in the congregation. And as I realized what was happening there, I thought, John of Patmos was a pastor. That's his primary identity. And suddenly I realized that's who I am. This is where all the action takes place. This is where death and birth and sin and salvation and depression and suicide and teenagers standing and running around and their parents standing around as guilty bystanders. And so suddenly those 2 days a week at the seminary became smaller and smaller and smaller in my identity. And after 3 years of that, I knew this is who I am. And then I started remembering things in my past, how they started all to fit together. My parents, the world I grew up in, Montana, this country, which I realized was holy land for me. And then I had just a stroke of blessing or good luck, whatever you want to call it. My church asked me to start a new congregation.
Oh.
And so I left New York to go to Baltimore and did that. And my wife and then I had to learn it from the ground up because I couldn't copy the guy I'd worked with.
Mm-hmm.
I had to learn how to do it my way and keep his integrity and my personality. So that worked out really well.
Well, I think what's interesting is for a lot of people who might know Eugene Peterson, and I do use the internet, and I'd mentioned on Facebook that we were going to do an interview with you, and someone wrote, in sort of a fun way, oh, is that the guy who wrote the Bible? Right? It's kind of fun. And I think for a lot of people, they think, well, wow, the real action would be in being, knowing Greek and knowing Hebrew and being able to engage the Bible at a whole new depth and level. And I would love to be able to teach like that and know those things and know that truth, because there's a sense for some that Christianity is about acquiring this knowledge and that there's these secret truths buried in the Bible, and if we could get them out. But then to hear you say doing that felt that was stifling to you and you wanted to get into where the real action was, inside of the dynamic process of people's lives and inside the real experiences that people are having, I think is a refreshing notion for people who feel that they're pastoring all the time and they have a dream that maybe they could interpret the Bible well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I probably couldn't have done it without those years of immersion in Hebrew and Greek.
Oh, interesting. Uh-huh.
But I could never have done the message without being a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
That's the language, the vernacular, the idioms. They came out of living with people, listening to them, listening to their language, and learning. My first 3 or 4 years as a pastor, I was just lecturing them from as I would have done as a seminary professor.
Oh.
And it took me maybe 3 years to realize, they're not. They could care less. They want to hear the living word here.
Yeah.
So I started listening to them and how they talked and the way they used the language. So that's what did it. I had to have those years. It's almost all the time I was writing, translating, I was aware of voices in my congregation. Things they would say, the way they would say it.
So I'm just imagining that you could almost hear when you're translating a passage, you could hear people you've known from your congregation saying those things.
That's right.
Like you imagine them being the ones who were saying it.
Yes.
That is such I find that so enlivening, that perspective, that rather than asking, what does the Bible say to these people, you're also asking, who do I know that would say these things?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a powerful bit. Well, we have to take another break here in just a minute, but when we come back, I want to ask you about this notion that you have in the introduction about Pastor Maybe and the idea of a witness and how that framed your the rest of what you write in the book and how it framed your ideas of what it means to be a pastor, that you were trying to figure out a way of not just telling people how they ought to live, but that you were trying to live it amongst them. So we'll come back here after the break, and we'll chat about that. I'm on the air here with Eugene Peterson, the author of a new book called The Pastor. It's a memoir, and you can pick it up at all the places where you buy books. We'll be back here with Eugene here after the break on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, and DougPagittRadio.com.